Of course, here is the rewritten story, expanded to meet your requirements while preserving the original narrative, tone, and key events. I've spent 28 years trying to forget what happened in the remote forests of northern Maine in the fall of 1995. The official reports, the ones buried in dusty filing cabinets, called it equipment malfunction and worker negligence. The insurance companies, eager to avoid a payout of that magnitude, labeled it an act of nature, a convenient, meaningless phrase. But I was there. I was one of the 8 women who walked out of those ancient woods, leaving behind nearly $1 million in machinery and a piece of our sanity. I know the truth about what drove us from that place in absolute primal terror. Our logging crew had been contracted by a major timber corporation to clear a section of old-growth forest in the northernmost reaches of Aroostook County, right up near the Canadian border, where the wilderness stretches unbroken for hundreds of miles. The job promised excellent pay for 6 weeks of intense work, clearing roughly 400 acres of prime eastern white pine and northern red spruce. Some of those trees were over 250 years old, massive giants that had been growing since before the American Revolution. Their trunks so thick that 3 of us holding hands couldn't reach around them. I remember looking at the contract when Patricia first showed it to us, spreading the papers out on the tailgate of her pickup. It seemed almost too good to be true. The timber company was offering premium rates, substantial hazard pay for the remote location, and generous bonuses for meeting the production schedule. Most of us had families to support, mortgages to pay, and the constant financial pressures that come with seasonal, dangerous work. 6 weeks at those rates would set us up comfortably for the lean winter months. None of us thought to ask why the rates were so high. None of us wondered why a company would pay a premium for what seemed like a straightforward cutting job in prime timber country. We were an experienced crew, confident in our abilities and our equipment. That confidence, we would soon learn, was our greatest vulnerability. We were a tight-knit crew of 8 women, all seasoned loggers who'd worked together in various configurations for years across the vast forests of northern New England. We had modern, well-maintained equipment, 2 Caterpillar feller bunchers, a John Deere skidder, and a powerful link belt loader capable of handling the largest logs we'd encounter. The company provided a base camp with sleeping quarters, a mess hall, and a maintenance shed about 2 miles from the designated work site. Our crew boss was Patricia Hendricks, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd started logging when there were maybe a handful of other women in the entire industry. She'd fought her way through every kind of discrimination and doubt to become one of the most respected operators in the region. Rosa Martinez ran our primary feller buncher with a precision that bordered on artistry, felling giants with the grace of a surgeon. Jennifer Clearwater and Maria Santos, our youngest members, handled the skidder work with a fearless energy that amazed us all. The rest of us, myself included, rotated through various support roles, maintenance, log sorting, and the 100 other tasks that keep a logging operation running smoothly. We trusted each other in the way that only people who work dangerous jobs together can. That trust would be tested in ways none of us could have imagined. What made this job unusual was its profound isolation. The nearest town was over 70 miles away, and the logging road to our site was a rutted dirt track that hadn't seen a grader in years. Patricia, who'd worked this general area before, warned us that cell phone coverage was non-existent. We'd be cut off from the outside world except for the company's satellite phone, reserved strictly for emergencies. The drive-in took nearly 5 hours from the last paved highway, climbing into terrain that felt more like the edge of the world than part of the continental United States. The trees grew larger, their canopy so thick that the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Our base camp was functional. Trailers for sleeping, a mess hall with a wood stove, and a maintenance shed. A diesel generator provided electricity, though we ran it sparingly to conserve fuel between the supply runs that came every 10 days. The first week proceeded without incident. The timber was exceptional, and we fell into our familiar rhythm. The work was hard but satisfying, set against the backdrop of a pristine wilderness painted in the first brilliant strokes of autumn. It was during our second week that the first unusual signs appeared. We started finding trees we had marked for cutting, with deep gouges in their bark. The scratches ran from about 7 feet off the ground up to nearly 11 feet high, far too high for a bear. They occurred in parallel sets of 4 or 5 lines, suggesting massive claws or incredibly strong fingers. The marks were fresh, with sap still weeping from the wounds, indicating they'd been made within hours of our discovery. Then Rosa Martinez, while performing her morning inspection, found the footprints. In the soft earth around her fella buncher, she discovered enormous prints that were disturbingly human-like, but much larger, measuring nearly 18 inches long. They showed 5 distinct toes and what appeared to be an arch, but their size was impossible. The prints formed a rough circle around the parked machine, as if something had been walking around it during the night, studying it. The depth of the impressions suggested a weight far beyond any human. More disturbing were the handprints we found on the cab windows, massive palm impressions pressed against the glass, nearly 8 feet above the ground. Most of the crew initially dismissed it as bear sign, though even Patricia had to admit the tracks didn't match any bear she'd ever seen. Jennifer Clearwater, who'd grown up hunting these forests, was the first to suggest something else. She'd heard stories from Penobscot elders about large, hairy creatures that lived in the deepest parts of the old-growth forests, beings that were almost human but possessed of incredible strength and intelligence, fiercely protective of their territory. We laughed it off, but an undercurrent of genuine unease had begun to ripple through our camp. The sounds started during our third week. At first, they were distant crashes in the forest, which we attributed to falling dead wood. But they became more frequent, closer, and occurred with a rhythm that suggested deliberate action. When we investigated, we found healthy, massive trees that had been pushed over, their root systems torn from the earth by a tremendous, unimaginable force. Most unsettling were the vocalizations we began hearing in the early morning hours before dawn. They were deep, resonant calls that echoed through the forest like nothing any of us had ever encountered. They weren't animal sounds, but they weren't human either. The calls had a deliberate, communicative quality. One call would echo from the ridge above us, answered by another from the valley below, then a third from deep in the groves to the east. I remember lying in my bunk, heart pounding, trying to convince myself I was hearing wolves. But I'd heard wolves howl, and this was nothing like it. These sounds were structured, almost musical, like a conversation held in a language older than time. When I mentioned it at breakfast, I saw from the looks on everyone's faces that they had all heard it too. The easy camaraderie of our crew had evaporated, replaced by nervous watchfulness. The first direct encounter happened during our fourth week. Rosa was working alone, felling a stand of large pines about a quarter-mile from the main crew. Suddenly, the normal sounds of the forest, the birds, the insects, went silent. In the eerie stillness, she heard something large moving through the underbrush nearby, something that was making no effort to conceal its approach. It was walking upright, breaking through brush that would stop a person in their tracks. The sounds grew closer, circling her position. Rosa, shaken, restarted her machine and began backing toward the main work area. The sounds of movement kept pace with her, staying just out of sight, shadowing her retreat. It was herding her, she realized, with a cold shock of fear, guiding her back toward us. When she reached the staging area, her voice shook as she told us what happened. Rosa was the calmest among us, but something had genuinely frightened her. Patricia decided to investigate immediately. 3 of us followed the skidder tracks back, armed with rifles. The underbrush was trampled in a path that followed Rosa's route. We found several clear footprints, showing details that left no doubt. The toe impressions had nail marks, not claws. The heel showed a human-like arch. These were the tracks of a bipedal creature standing at least 8 feet tall and weighing perhaps 600 or 700 pounds. But the most disturbing discovery was how saplings along the path had been broken and twisted, some woven together to create partial screens. We were looking at evidence of tool use and environmental modification, hallmarks of higher intelligence. Whatever was out there wasn't just a large animal, it was thinking, planning. That evening, Patricia distributed hunting rifles. We weren't sure what we were defending against, but it was clear something large, strong, and intelligent was taking an active interest in our operation. The attacks on our equipment began the following night. We'd established a 2-woman watch. Around 3 in the morning, the guards heard the sound of metal being struck. They found our backup generator had been attacked. The metal housing was dented and torn, as if something had tried to rip it apart with its bare hands. Fuel lines were yanked loose, and most unsettling were the handprints pressed into the soft metal, showing fingers much longer and thicker than any humans. The attack seemed experimental. Components had been removed and placed in neat piles nearby, as if studied. The attacks escalated over the next several nights. Each morning brought new evidence of systematic investigation. Hydraulic systems were dismantled, electrical wires were pulled apart and studied. On the 4th night, we discovered our tormentor had figured out how to operate our tools. A chainsaw had been started and run until it was out of fuel, leaving a crude cutting pattern on a log pile. The creature had figured out how to prime it, set the choke, and pull the starter cord through observation alone. On the 6th night, we finally got a clear look. Maria and Jennifer were on guard duty when they heard sounds near the maintenance shed. They split up to approach from 2 directions. What they saw defied everything they knew. A creature that stood nearly 9 feet tall was systematically going through our spare parts inventory. It was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair and had the general proportions of a human, but scaled up to impossible size. Its arms were long, its shoulders impossibly broad. Its head was humanoid but primitive, with a pronounced sagittal crest and heavy brow ridges. But its eyes, reflecting in their flashlight beams, showed unmistakable intelligence. When Jennifer accidentally stepped on a branch, the creature turned toward the sound. For several long seconds, woman and creature stared at each other. Then the thing opened its mouth and produced a roar so loud and powerful, they felt it as a physical pressure in their chests. It didn't attack or flee. It stood its ground, assessing them. Then it turned and walked. Not ran, but walked. Into the forest with a casual confidence that was more terrifying than any aggression could have been. The next morning, we found our main fella buncher had been destroyed with a ferocity that left us stunned. The machine's cab, made of half-inch thick steel plates, had been ripped open like a tin can. The engine compartment was systematically dismantled, its components scattered. The hydraulic lines had been yanked out and tied into knots, a clear demonstration of both strength and intelligent mockery. The creature could have killed any of us, but it had focused its aggression on our equipment. We were dealing with something making deliberate choices. Patricia made the decision to evacuate immediately, but when she tried the satellite phone to report our situation, she found it had been disabled. Crucial components had been removed. The creatures understood its function and had deliberately cut us off. We were completely isolated. Loading our remaining equipment took all morning. As we worked, we could feel eyes watching us. We caught glimpses of dark, massive shapes moving in the tree line. They weren't hiding anymore. We also discovered they had been in our living quarters. Personal belongings had been moved and examined, though nothing was stolen. Clothing had been unfolded and refolded. I found a letter from my daughter, which I kept in my jacket pocket, had been carefully removed and placed on my pillow. The intimacy of that violation was somehow more disturbing than all the equipment damage. Our convoy of trucks and the remaining machinery left the site around noon. I rode with Patricia, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I've faced every danger in these woods," she said quietly, "but I've never felt like prey before. That's what we were out there. Prey." As we drove, movement in the trees paralleled our progress. We were being escorted out. About 10 miles from the work site, we found our path blocked. A massive, healthy white pine had been snapped in half and lay across the road. The trunk had been broken by what could only have been enormous applied force. As we stood there, the calls began again, this time from all around us. We were surrounded. Patricia made the call to abandon everything. We grabbed our personal belongings and weapons and began hiking down the mountain road, leaving behind hundreds of thousands of dollars in machinery. Behind us, we could hear the sounds of our abandoned vehicles being explored and destroyed. The hike to the nearest town took nearly 20 hours. We were constantly aware of being followed. The creatures stayed in the forest alongside the road, keeping pace but never showing themselves. We walked through the night, too afraid to stop. The escort wasn't overtly threatening, but the psychological pressure was immense. We were being shepherded out of their territory by beings who were choosing to let us live. When we finally reached civilization, our account was met with skepticism. Company investigators and state police were dispatched to the site, suspecting we'd fabricated the story to cover up theft. But they found nothing. No trace of our abandoned trucks and machinery. Everything had vanished, as if it had never existed. The investigators found no tire tracks or drag marks. The machines were simply gone. The situation was resolved only when classified satellite reconnaissance images became available. They showed massive disturbances in the forest around our worksite and large bipedal figures moving through the trees. The images provided undeniable proof that something matching our descriptions was active in that area. They also revealed the fate of our equipment. It had been systematically dismantled, the components scattered and hidden for miles throughout the forest. Each member of our crew was required to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements in exchange for generous compensation. The meeting took place in a windowless federal building with lawyers and men in suits who warned us that any public discussion would result in severe legal consequences under national security statutes. I asked one of them why it mattered so much. His answer chilled me. "Because if people knew they were real," he said, "they'd want to find them. And if they found them, the creatures would have to respond. We're not protecting the creatures from people, ma'am. We're protecting people from the consequences." The truth, as I learned years later from a retired Forest Service ranger, was that the government had known about these creatures for decades. Small populations of what could only be described as relict hominids lived in the most remote areas, their habitats carefully managed to minimize human contact. Our logging operation had inadvertently encroached on one of these protected areas. They weren't monsters, but intelligent beings with complex social structures that had kept them hidden for millennia. I've spent the past 28 years trying to process what I experienced. The nightmares have faded, but I still wake up sometimes hearing those impossible calls. I moved to the city, as far from the deep woods as I could get. The other women from our crew scattered, each dealing with the trauma in her own way. We drifted apart, the shared memory too heavy to carry together. I'm telling this story now because I believe people have a right to know. The legal agreements I signed may still be binding, but I'm old enough that the consequences matter less than the truth. Those magnificent, terrifying beings deserve recognition and protection. My health is failing, and I've carried this secret alone for too long. We are not alone on this planet, and we never have been. The wilderness holds secrets our civilization has chosen to ignore, and one of those secrets walked through my life 28 years ago and changed everything. Some nights, When the city is quiet, I can almost hear them again, their deep calls echoing across the mountains. And I wonder what they're saying about us, the species that keeps pushing further into their world. I hope I never find out. But I suspect that day is coming, whether we are ready for it or not. The forest remembers, and so do I.